Now, Heather Grady, it'd be interesting to hear your particular perspective from an NGO rights-based perspective, how you see the evolution of this field. Sam talked about governance gaps, and we spent a lot of this panel talking about corporate responsibility as a potential response to those shortfalls in institutional and sometimes legal capacity inside developing countries in this area. You've been on the ground in this regard. What's your perspective on how things are evolving?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Center for American Progress for inviting me to speak today and be on a panel with such esteemed panelists. And I think, again, I would agree with everything that's been said, and I think we're really making progress on the Just Jobs agenda. I think what I'd like to add is more around the international development assistance framework and what is really happening on the ground. And I think that the kinds of good examples that were mentioned is what the kind of model that we need to follow. But we need to broaden it out because most people in developing countries work in the informal economy, either in agriculture or in off-farm employment. And so the kinds of values that we've been talking about on this panel do need to be expanded. One of the things that we're doing in Realizing Rights is working on a process for the Millennium Development Goals review process, which is going on right now. And in September at the UN General Assembly, there will be a development summit, a high-level plenary meeting on the MDGs. And as many of you may know, MDG 1 is about halving extreme poverty and hunger. And the minister mentioned that earlier. There have been great gains in that area, but if you take China out of the equation, the gains have not been significant. There's also MDG Goal 8, which is around global partnerships, and that's where the private sector comes in. And I think that what we really need to do is think more about how to integrate Just Jobs, this agenda, which is, as the ILO has pioneered, the decent work agenda, more firmly into our work on development assistance. I was saying earlier that I was invited to, our organization helped to do a seminar at Harvard in March on the MDGs and human rights. On the first iteration of the agenda, the decent work agenda wasn't even mentioned. And I think that's because people focus more on the right to health or the right to education. We see decent work and just jobs and social protection as an accelerator for all of the Millennium Development Goals. And it's also a way for countries to get out of aid dependence. It's the only way, because developing countries need to have sufficient government revenue generated domestically. And it's not just more jobs, it's better jobs. So I think everything the panelists have said fits in with this. There are several challenges here. One is that I think global trade policy in the last 15 or 20 years has been mainly around telling developing countries that their comparative advantage is cheap labor. And that doesn't really generate the kind of sustainable and equitable growth that we need. So challenging that has been important, and I think that what the G20 is talking about is really taking us down the right road. Another challenge is that a lot of government departments and ministries of labor in particular have been really weakened over the last several years by cuts in the number of staff. We have a program on the ground in Liberia and Ghana, and we're working closely, for example, with the Liberian Ministry of Labor. They need more support to do the most basic of things, a labor force survey to see what work is being done, thinking about gender issues in the labor market. We talked about the importance of fair labor practices, but if they don't have enough inspectors, it's very difficult for them to monitor what's happening. But there are a lot of opportunities, and I think that we do have the chance this year we have 5 more years left to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, the targets that we've set, and I think we're really on the right track. Some of the examples that we're working on, in Ghana, for example, the ILO and other agencies have a very good decent work country program that focuses on local economic development. This means supporting micro and small businesses to expand, help them get access to capital, which is very important, and help them to understand what are the human rights standards that they need to follow. Another example is the expansion of the corporate responsibility agenda. I think that John Ruggie's work as the special representative on business and human rights is very good. His framework is being applied more broadly. If you look at global investment, it's not just on the factory floor that we need to respect human rights. It's also, if you look at a value chain, for example, for Unilever or Coca-Cola, it involves sugarcane producers, it involves citrus pickers, and all kinds of jobs. So I think we pay attention to that. And then just a couple more examples. In a country like Liberia, there are farm workers in the cocoa industry. We've been working with them to see how they can work with their government representatives to get a better price for cocoa. And I think that companies like Cadbury that are working with us are very interested in making cocoa producing a sustainable livelihood, because they need that as well. That's important for their value chain. And finally, an example of informal workers in Liberia. We work with groups that are street vendors. Sometimes we've talked about the different policies that are needed. The importance of having informal workers have a stronger voice and visibility vis-a-vis their own government representatives is very important. So we're strengthening their negotiating power and their voice. And I think those are all components of what will be in the future a broad just jobs agenda that succeeds.
Terrific. Thank you very much.
If you want to tackle the question of agricultural subsidies, that really depends on people in the US and Europe saying to their elected officials, this isn't going to work. And I think that the more we tie the question of subsidies together with development, the better. And let's remember, the problem of child labor, which everyone cares about, is a symptom of a problem. And the problem is the lack of just jobs for adults in their families. And that is very tied in with lack of agricultural and other opportunities.